Hello everybody, this is Professor Watts and this is the tutorial video for homework 4, which features the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. And let me just remind us before we get into the Excel worksheets that in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework we can model pretty much everything we've been discussing in class in terms of business cycles and fluctuations. So whether we're talking about real business cycles and positive and negative real shocks, or whether we're talking about the Keynesian system and positive and negative nominal shocks or aggregate demand slash total spending shocks. So the aggregate demand supply framework is a very useful tool, and that's what we'll be using in the model in Excel, and we'll just be working out several very real world type scenarios. So you will open the Excel file, which is called homework 4, and you'll see a setup that looks exactly like this. And this particular file here, it's just a demo file, so I have problems that are similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar to what you'll see in the homework. In the homework, you'll have a total of 4 problems, and each problem is on its own worksheet. So make sure you find, first of all, the different worksheets at the bottom. I've had a few people not realize, oh, there was more than one worksheet. Yeah. There's going to be 4 worksheets to click on down here, okay, and then work through each scenario. Okay, so you make sure you do each one of them. Okay, now we'll go to the first one here, demo 1. And the first thing you'll do, now you'll see there's a lot going on here, but you actually will only be able to enter values in the highlighted cells. So that includes, first off, the values for aggregate demand growth or total nominal spending growth for scenario 1. Well, actually, the initial part of the scenario, which is going to be AD1, and then AD2, which is the final part of the scenario. Now, let me note up front as well that that may change. It may not. It may stay the same. So you have to read the scenario very carefully to determine whether that changes or not. And then likewise for the solo 1 and solo 2. Now, in some cases, I'll give you the initial solo or AD growth rate. In some cases, I'll have you plug it in. But in either case, you are only responsible for entering values into the highlighted cells here for our initial and then final conditions for our total spending growth, which is aggregate demand, recall, and then the solo growth rate, which is the real potential growth rate of the economy based on utilizing all of the factors of production. We will, of course, have a short and aggregate supply curve, and that's kind of based on the solo curve. So this stuff is all pre-programmed. You don't have to mess with it. And then I also have some equilibrium solver stuff over here, and then you won't be able to even mess with that, but what you'll be able to do is look at the solver for equilibrium 1 and 2 and come up with the results for inflation, real growth and inflation rates based on our spending growth and solo growth rates. Okay. And if you're not familiar with this model, we've been talking about it in class quite a bit. If you're not familiar with it, I will invite you, I'm not going to rehash it completely right now, but I will invite you to watch the lecture video on aggregate supply and aggregate demand framework, which is also posted in the Unit 4 section in Blackboard. Okay, so let's work through the scenario. Let's see how this is going to play out. It says, an economy has a natural solo growth rate of 2% and spending growth of 8%. Insert these values for AD1 and solo 1 and use the equilibrium 1 solver to identify initial equilibria for real growth and inflation and mark these values in cells C10 and C11. Okay, so our initial equilibria. So I have a solo growth rate of 2%. That's going to be solo 1. And spending growth of 8%. So that's going to be AD1. So you can forget about the values that we started with there. I should have just started it like this. I should have started it with nothing there. But regardless, we know the solo growth rate is going to be 2. Okay, I'm getting this right here. And this aggregate demand growth, spending growth is going to be 8. So I'm plugging those values in. Then that gives me my initial setup. And let's refer to the graph now for aggregate demand and the solo rate. And remember, equilibrium in this model occurs where, let's highlight this, equilibrium in this model occurs where aggregate demand meets the short and aggregate supply curve. So I'm on aggregate demand 1 and SRAS 1, and that's right here. Okay, so we can go find our real growth rate, All right, this gets between 2 and 4% on the horizontal axis here, so it's going to be about 3%. And then the inflation rate, well, look, we can just come right over here and see that that's at 5% on the vertical axis, which is the inflation rate. Oops. Okay, remember the horizontal axis here is the real growth rate. So I said growth is 3%, real growth is 3%, and inflation's 5%. Well, let's look at the solver, and sure enough, that's what the solver says as well. The solver says, yep, growth is 3%, and inflation's 5%. So we can go ahead and plug those values in for the initial equilibria. Real growth is 3%, and notice that's already formatted as percent for you, and inflation is 5%. Notice also, now you can type in your values here, but if you try to type in something that's wrong, like a letter, it won't let you because it's validated. So you have to type, or you can click on the arrow, and I give you all the possible, I give you, every possible whole number value you could possibly have for real growth and inflation. So you can either go to the drag down list and click it, or you can just type it right in there. Okay. So there's if you look at the solver and look at the graph, there's basically no way you can get this wrong, provided that you read the scenario and put the proper values in. Okay, so that's our initial setup. Now, of course, what we're interested here in is a change, right? We're going to have things change. We're going to have business cycle fluctuations. So we're going to have growth go down or up, right? Because you could have a recession, things going down, or you could have things booming, right? You could have things going up. So in the homework itself, we're going to modify, in the homework itself, we're going to model every possible situation. Here, we're just going to do a couple demo ones. Okay, so let's keep reading the scenario. It says, an investment boom in this economy causes its solo growth rate to rise to 4%, while spending growth remains at 8%. Okay, so that's going to be AD2 and solo 2. Now we might have to scroll over here a little bit to find the solo 2, or you know what, we can zoom out. Let's do that so we can see the graph at the same time. And watch what happens when I change the solo growth rate to 4%. So I'm plugging that in over here, and that's going to shift the solo curve, and along with it, the short and aggregate supply curve. So you'll notice, and let me highlight that for you, and you'll notice, let's maybe highlight this in green. Okay, so now we've got the solo 2, which is the darker dotted blue line, and the SRS2, which is kind of the lime green, and those have shifted to the right. Why? Because we've gone up in growth space, right? We've gone from a 2% potential growth rate to a 4%, so we're shifting the solo curve to the right. Okay, now spending growth remains the same, it says. So let's keep that for AD2. Let's keep that at 8%. So that doesn't change. And if it did change, that would shift the AD curve, but now we're not changing it, so we're on the initial AD curve, right? So we're still on AD1. So where does equilibrium occur now? Well, again, that's where AD meets the short and aggregate supply curve, the new short and aggregate supply curve. So we're going to be right here. And I can look at the graph and see, okay, right there, I'm going to be at a growth rate of something like maybe 5%. And an inflation rate coming over to the vertical axis of somewhere between 0 and 5. It's going to be 2 or 3. Okay. Now the graph doesn't tell me the exact answers, but I want to look at the graph to make sure I understand what's happening here visually, and then I can go up to the solver for equilibrium 2 now and realize, oh, okay, the growth rate is up to 5%, so we can plug that in here, and the inflation rate has changed to 3%. So I can find that here. Positive 3% right there, okay? And then the only other thing I need to do is indicate the type of shock. And here again, it's validated, use the drop down. So is it a positive real shock, negative real shock, positive demand shock, or spending shock, nominal shock, or negative demand shock? Well, I shifted the solo curve, right? That's real business cycle, right? So that's a real shock. We got increase in factors of production. We got an increase in capital in this case because of more investment. So I know I have a positive real shock. Okay, and that's really all there is to it. Okay, find the initial equilibrium. Make sure we enter the values for AD1 and solo 1. Okay, find the final equilibrium by changing one or the other, AD or solo 2, and then indicate the type of shock right here. So you need to fill in every highlighted cell, every yellow highlighted cell, and make sure that conforms to the scenario. Report your results, and you're done. It's that easy, right? Okay, so let's look at one more demo problem. Let's move over to demo 2, negative aggregate demand. Even telling you what's happening here in the demo. Okay, because these are just very generic. But in the homework itself, I'm not going to tell you whether it's a positive or negative, real or nominal shock, but I'm going to give you actual historical scenarios, mostly from U.S. history, and you're going to have to figure it out. Okay, but you use the model, and things should become very clear to you, especially if you've been paying attention to the lectures in class. Okay, let's start fresh in this model. It says an economy begins with a solo growth rate of 3% and spending growth of 5%. Insert these values for AD1 and solo 1 and use the equilibrium 1 solver to find the initial equilibrium. Okay, so what do we have? We have a solo growth rate of 3%. That's going to be solo 1. And we have a spending growth rate of 5%. So I'm going to plug that in for AD1. 3% solo growth, 5% spending growth. Okay, now again, look at the graph to get a sense of what's going on. And I will pinpoint that for you. So SRAS meets AD right here. That's at a real growth rate of 4%. And at an inflation rate, it looks like inflation's somewhere down close to 0, but still positive. So it's something like 1%, I'm guessing. So I got 4% real growth, 1% inflation. Let's look at the solver to see what it is exactly. And yep, I was right. It's 4% real growth and 1% inflation. And then we'll move on and see what happens. And so keep going through the scenario here. A stock market crash causes a negative wealth shock, which drives spending growth to minus 5%. So spending growth is going to fall and it's going to go negative. So let's go to the type of shock. What kind of shock is that? We know it's negative, right? Is it real? Because things are going down. Is it a real shock or a demand shock? Well, it says spending growth, right? AD, aggregate demand, is total spending. So that's going to be a negative demand shock. Okay, and then let's plug the values in. Spending growth is going to go to minus 5%. Minus 5. Now, there's no indication that the solo growth rate changed. And in the homework, I'll be very explicit. Did it change or not? So it didn't, so that's going to stay at 3%. Okay, and now we're ready to find equilibrium 2. So equilibrium 2, it's going to occur down here where the aggregate demand 2, which is this kind of purplish line, meets the short-run aggregate supply curve right here. So what's true about growth right here? It looks like growth has fallen below the 0 point. So growth is something like minus 1 maybe. So here y growth equals minus 1% maybe. And then inflation looks like has also gone below. Yep, there's 0% inflation. So inflation is down here. It looks like it's not quite at minus 5. So maybe I'm thinking inflation rate is something like minus. And let's see what it is exactly by looking at solver 2. Well, solver 2 says growth has just fallen to 0. Okay, so I'll plug that in. And then inflation is minus 5. Okay, so the solver tells you exactly, but I do want you to look at the graph and see what's going on here. All right, so I've found out what happens because we started with nice positive growth and low inflation, but we had a negative demand shock, so we end up with a much lower growth rate, 0 in this case, which would be a recession because it's a fall from the trend growth rate, and a very steep decline in inflation. So that would be known as a deflationary recession in this particular case. Okay, so that's how you do it. Not much to it. Go in there, read the scenarios carefully, fill in all the highlighted boxes, save your file with your name, submit it through Blackboard. You should know the drill by now, just like with all the other homework. And I will look forward to checking out your work. And then we'll get ready to do midterm 2, which will be a recap of homework 3 and 4. See you soon. Bye.